Welcome everyone to Optimization in Oslo. I'm very happy today to have Juan Reyes, who's going to speak virtually from Quito, and he's going to talk about bilevel learning for inverse problems. Juan Carlos.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for the invitation to give this talk at the seminar on optimization in Oslo. I will talk about actually a topic that has been in my interest for the last years, and it's actually bilevel learning for inverse problems. And this is a joint work with many collaborators. Among them, I would like to highlight David Villasís and Paula Castro. David was a PhD student of mine, and Paula is finishing her thesis this year. And apart of that, several colleagues from different universities that have collaborated in this endeavor. So let me explain a little bit in this broad picture what the problem setting is about and what we intend to do. So this is a machine learning, what we call machine learning landscape. And of course, everybody knows that we are living this artificial intelligence revolution right now. And so this is a small diagram of what's happening there. So in this artificial intelligence set, you have a subset which consists of the machine learning techniques. Among these techniques, you have the typical mathematical tools like regression or k-means or support vector machines. But recently, you have a more concentrated the neural networks field within the machine learning set, right? So, and in these neural networks, you have also the deep learning. And as you know, the deep learning is responsible for the huge discussion nowadays. And we all know that the deep learning algorithms are very efficient at handling complex tasks, for instance, speech recognition. But the downside of it is that it requires a lot of data. And more important than that is the lack of interpretability that the results have. And this, of course, is not important if you consider, for instance, ChatGPT, where if you get an answer, then you can ask back and then you get an improved one. But in critical applications like self-driving cars, medical diagnosis, financial applications, and so on, is a difficult thing to deal with, and you cannot rely on the results of such algorithms. So the bilevel learning is a mathematical technique, so it's within the machine learning set, but of course it's not related directly, although there are some extensions, but in principle it's not related to the deep learning setting. So the advantages of the bilevel learning is that since it's based on mathematical techniques, you gain explainable models, and the price that you have to pay for that is a thorough understanding of the underlying mathematical models. Of course, for us, it's a downside in principle, but it's a huge advantage since we are mathematicians and we want to investigate the structures behind the problems. And specifically in this talk, I'm going to focus on the underlying models being inverse problems. And more specifically, I'm talking a lot about imaging today. So the setting of the talk is the following one. I will explain what the bilevel learning setting is about. Then I will focus on the imaging inverse problems, some recent results we have concerning a unifying framework. I will give in detail some application example consisting of MRI, and then some conclusions about our work and future perspectives. So in principle, a general inverse problem consists of finding a solution, an ideal solution U from some corrupted data F by solving, in principle, this frequencies equation. So you have that the corrupted data is the map of the ideal one with a so-called forward operator, and it's affected also with some noise. Now, of course, in principle, you cannot recover directly the solution U out of this frequencies equation. You can just imagine if T is, for instance, the identity, you cannot just put the noise on the other side and obtain the ideal solution, since you don't have what the noise is about, right? But more generally, this operator T has an unbounded inverse, and the problem is therefore ill-posed, and you need something, some techniques to deal with that issue. And a part of that, the noise also has to be modeled. So typically what you do in such a setting, such an inverse problem, is you regularize the problem by adding some a priori information about the solution. The setting we use is the variational one, so it's based on a regularization of an energy. So in this case, our model, our inverse problem, consists of a prior, and this prior term incorporates some information you know about the solution. For instance, if you know that the solution is continuous, then you incorporate that knowledge in a prior. Or if you know that it's piecewise constant, that's also important to incorporate in a prior. And a part of that, you have the data model, and the data model is responsible for two things. The first one is that the solution has to obey a certain forward model, and a part of that, you have to model the noise that is involved in the application at hand. And in between, you have the so-called hyperparameters or parameters lambda, and these are key to obtain a good reconstruction of the solution. And the results of this variational inverse problem depends heavily on the prior that you choose, the data model that you consider, but also on the choice of the hyperparameters that are involved. Let me give you some application examples so that you get the big picture of that. So this is the total variation image denoising. I will get into detail in a while. But in this total variation image denoising, you have the data fidelity model. The data fidelity model matches the corrupted image with respect to the one you want to obtain. And this square term is responsible also for modeling the Gaussian noise. And a part of that, you have the prior, and the prior is the total variation in this case. And the total variation is responsible for a piecewise constant reconstruction of the image. So if you take a look at these cards here, a piecewise constant reconstruction is the ideal scenario for that. And of course, you have to choose the lambda weight wisely. So for instance, if you consider a lambda weight which is very high, then you obtain an image which is over-regularized. You get rid of the noise, but you get also rid of the details of the image. And a part of that, if lambda is small, then you obtain an under-regularized image, and you don't get rid of the noise at all. So you have to consider the ideal scenario is to choose the lambda in such a way that you get an intermediate regularization where you get rid of the noise, but the details of the image are preserved. This is the case of the MRI setting. So in this context, what is done is you consider a patient in the MRI machine, and you sample in the K-space, you sample the Fourier coefficients. And if you have a full sample of the Fourier coefficients, that you get a good reconstruction of the image. But in principle, you have to invest a lot of time to sample all the K-space. So the setting is the following one. So we want to consider a pattern that is not fully sampled the K-space, but we obtain a good reconstruction of the image that it's involved. And in our variational approach or variational setting, you have to choose two different types of quantities. So the first one is the lambda coefficient that was also present before, so that it compensates the regularization against the data fidelity. But in the data fidelity, you have also the sigma i's, which are 0 or 1, depending on the fact that you sample or not a given point in the K-space. And the data fidelity model is related to the observations that you have and the image affected by the Fourier transform. So a third example is the material parameter identification. And in this case, for instance, you want to consider with an underlying model that it's given by this PDE, you want to find the coefficient that is involved, the material coefficient that is involved there. And you have, of course, some observations that you want to match. And in this case, also the total variation is very useful because you have a piecewise reconstruction of the solution, and you can observe on the right-hand side what's happening if you consider a different type of regularization on the upper part. and if you consider the total variation regularization in the lower picture. So the choice of the regularization is important, and the choice of the parameters, either the lambda or some sample parameters, is important to get a better reconstruction. So the question is how to do that, how to choose the lambda without having to tune every time and to do trial and error. And this is what exactly the bilevel learning problem is about. So in the bilevel learning, what we assume is that there exists a training set of noisy measurements and ground truth data, and these noisy measurements are important to learn from. So in the bilevel learning problem, you consider the loss function on the upper part, and you try to match the ground truth with the solution that you obtain from your variational setting. So you have an optimization problem on the first level, and also you have in the lower level another optimization problem. And the other optimization problem is related to the energy that was written before. So you have to find the parameters or hyperparameters that minimizes the loss, and your solution is provided by the solution of this variational inverse problem. So the advantages of this bilevel learning setting is that the operator T may be linear, nonlinear, non-local. It may be a PDE solution operator or any other thing in principle, of course, with different difficulties. The regularizer is typically strongly convex, but maybe non-smooth. And the lambda is not only a scalar, it can be a vector, it can be a function, and so on. So you have the structure of an upper level, a lower level, and you have to deal with this bilevel learning problem. So as I mentioned before, the advantage for us, the disadvantage for other specialists is the fact that you have to investigate this bilevel problem in detail. So let me go to the very simple case, and the very simple case is the linear inverse problem setting. So you have in the bilevel with one single pair, you have just to match the ground truth, and you have a loss function. You have to find the lambda coefficients, and the constraint is provided by this variational problem. So in this case, you can imagine you have just the square term in this part. The T operator is linear. We assume that, and R is a convex term that is smooth in this context. So you have a convex problem in the lower level, so you can replace just the lower level problem with the necessary and sufficient optimality condition, and you obtain a single level reformulation of the problem. Now, you can prove different things here. This is the very straightforward case. So you have you can prove that the solutions of both problems coincide, and if you don't have additional mixed constraints, of course. And you can prove easily constraint qualification conditions and existence of Lagrange multipliers, which just depend on the operator T. And the issue is what happens if you cannot find the derivative of the regularization term, or T is a nonlinear operator. And that's what the discussion will be about in the next slides. So let me first provide you a perspective of what has been done in the past. So the general bilevel framework for linear inverse problems was proposed, as far as I know, in 2003 by the group of Eldad Haber, and they provided there a proof of concept. There was no analysis involved, but they introduced for the first time this bilevel framework. Thereafter, in 2009, this was extended to learning of Markov random fields in the imaging world, and they provided there some algorithms based on gradient descent to find the solutions, also with no so much analysis involved. We started to work in 2011, when the first paper appeared in 2012, considering bilevel learning, also in the imaging setting, but our contribution was related to consider non-smooth sparsity-based regularizers. In particular, we considered the total variation one, and we provided there some analytical results as well as some algorithms. Thereafter, the field extended quite a bit with many applications, many other regularization terms. And more recently, the field or the bilevel learning setting was extended also to deal with nonlinear operators, either arising in inverse problems or in variational data assimilation. Now, what happens in imaging, actually? So let me start by explaining you the total variation setting. So here we have a corrupted image with some corrupted by some noise, and we want to obtain a clean one using the energy model. And as I mentioned before, the data fidelity, the more easy one, is related to the Gaussian noise, and this square norm that has to be minimized. But of course, if you don't add anything else, this square norm just provide you the original corrupted image if you want to minimize that. So you have to add some information to obtain some solution that makes sense. Now, the isotropic total variation is actually a term that enforces sparsity. So it considers just the Euclidean norm of the gradient of the image. So as you know, the Euclidean norm is enforces sparsity in the same way as the absolute value or the L1 norm does in the one-dimensional case. So in this context, you have the gradient of the image in every pixel, you have the Euclidean norm, and you enforce the sparsity on the gradient. That means you enforce that the solution or the image is piecewise constant, and that's in some cases very important. Now you have to combine both terms, and you consider the energy model. You have to consider the energy model with some balancing. In this case, you have different values of the coefficients lambda that have to be tuned or have to be optimized so that you get a better reconstruction of the original image. This is a very easy example of what the total variation does. So the original corrupted image or corrupted signal in this case is the grade one that oscillates quite a bit, and then it jumps down and it also jumps up in the final part. And what you do is, if you find out the solution of this variational problem, then you find the black line that you have here, that it preserves the jumps, but of course gets rid of the oscillations of the signal that you have. There are other imaging regularizers that are very popular. Another one is the anisotropic total variation, and this considers just the L1 norm of the gradient, so it's just the sum of the absolute values. As you know, it enforces also the sparsity on the partial derivatives of the image, so it also enforces or provokes that the solution has a piecewise constant structure. The drawback, though, of the total variation regularizers is the so-called staircase effect. And since you want to obtain, or the prior information is that the solution is piecewise constant, if you have a smooth variation, what you obtain is a reconstruction that it's just a staircase, and it's piecewise constant, and it's not the ideal scenario if you have smooth intensity variations. So as a solution of that, the total generalized variation was introduced in 2009. And this regularization term, this prior, consists of two terms. And the first one is related to the first order derivative. And let us suppose in this case that you have W equal to K of U. Then if you replace the K of U here, then you can observe that you have a second order information of the image in this regularization term on the right-hand side. This is the Frobenius norm. You have the Hessian-like information here, and you enforce the sparsity also in the deformation. So it preserves smooth intensity variations, and that's the ideal scenario for this total generalized variation. So it's sparsity on the second derivative as a broad message here. There are, of course, other images.
Could you repeat what W represents in this equation?
W is an artificial variable.
Okay.
It's not the image directly. So you have the image here, and this is an artificial variable.
Which is part of the optimization variables? I don't understand it and would like to, but maybe we can leave for the...
Yeah, it is part of the optimization of the variational setting. Yeah, exactly. So you have to find U and you have to find W.
All right, thanks.
So Apart of that, you have different other type of regularizers related to this type of problems as well. And the main message of this slide is that most imaging regularizers are non-smooth sparsity-based. So either you have the L1 norm, the Euclidean norm, or the Frobenius norm, but all of them enforces a sparsity in some sense. They are convex, of course, but they are not smooth. So this is an example of what happens, for instance, with a noisy image and the smooth intensity variations. So in this case, if you denoise with total variation, then you can observe that you have this kind of patchy structure when you have the smooth intensity variations, and this is exactly the staircasing effect. Now, if you consider a total variation of second order, then you get rid of this staircasing problem, but you also get rid of several details on the image. But in the total generalized variation, you have a smooth intensity transitions that are well preserved in this case. So what happens with the bilevel learning with the total variation? Here you have, in the same idea or the same setting as before, you have the loss function. You consider only one, just for the sake of the exposition, only one training pair. So you match the solution you want to obtain to the ground truth, and you have to choose the lambda weights so that you minimize the loss function subject to this lower level problem. And in this lower level problem, you have again the total variation structure, which is in the regularization part, and you have to choose the lambda I that it's accompanying the Gaussian noise model. You don't have the possibility to take the derivative of this term, but since you have convexity, you can also replace the problem, the lower level problem, by the necessary and sufficient optimality condition. And in this case, the necessary and sufficient optimality condition in primal dual form is provided by these three types of relations. And the first one is very easy. So you just have an equation or a set of equations that it's quite standard. But the other two type of terms are more complicated. So pixel-wise, you have to match these two type of relations. The first one that considers the dual multiplier in this scalar product with the gradient, and it has to match the Euclidean norm of the gradient, and that has to happen pixel-wise. And also this dual variable, the Euclidean norm of this dual variable has to be smaller than 1 pixel-wise. And these two type of relations are the complicated ones to deal with. So first message is the standard constraint qualification conditions do not hold in this case. So you cannot argue the existence of Lagrange multipliers for these type of problems when you reformulate with a single level problem. So different tools are required to deal with that, and there are several possibilities, and I will try to explain what we did in the last years concerning that. We have to deal with these two type of relations. So you can investigate different things here. You can, and I'm sure you know about, you can investigate that with a variational analysis point of view and finding out what the Mordukhovich stationarity is about, for instance. What we did in the last years was something different. So we consider or we focus in these two type of relations. And what we realize is actually that if you consider, for instance, the set where the gradient doesn't vanish, then you have from this equation here, you have a perfect alignment of the vectors. So the solution of this equation in this case is just Q is equal to K of U divided by the Euclidean norm, and you have a perfect alignment of the two vectors for that case. Now, if K of U in that pixel is equal to 0, then you can have that Q is smaller than 1 or equal than 1, but in both cases, you have also an alignment of the two type of vectors. So you have that the K of U and QI in each pixel are collinear, and you can use that information wisely. So what we did actually was to introduce a change of variables, or we lifted the problem and introduce more variables. And we described each QI by this change of variables, and also each gradient by this change of variables. But since we realized that the two vectors are collinear in each case, the angles coincide. Now, if the angles coincide here, and you just use this information and replace QI and K of UI with these variables in these relations here, you obtain actually this structure, which is more familiar to us. So the radius, of course, has to be greater than 0. The other one has to be greater than 0. You have that delta has to be smaller than 1, since the delta is basically the Euclidean norm. And a part of that, R and 1 minus delta are in complementarity to each other. So you have a more standard complementarity problem there, and you can consider or exploit that information wisely. So this mixed complementarity system can be incorporated in the single level reformulation. So now the bilevel learning problem can be written as a mathematical program with complementarity constraints. You have the upper level problem. You have the first of the conditions of the necessary and sufficient optimality conditions. You have the change of variables, so you add a lot of information, or you add more variables there. And a part of that, you have the complementarity problem as a constraint in this case. And as you may know, the MPCCs have been investigated in the last decades a lot. So you have several results concerning constraint qualification conditions, stationarity concepts, second order sufficient optimality conditions, also topological properties of the solution, and also some solution methods that can be considered for this type of problems. Now, what we obtain as result, this is just for the TV bilevel learning problem, this slide, but we could prove actually that under suitable conditions, the solution satisfies the so-called MPCC RCP-LD qualification condition, and you can prove the existence of Lagrange multipliers, and you obtain this strong stationarity system that characterizes your solution. So this is a good news for the analysis, but also for the numerical part. The downside in principle is that this qualification condition is one of the weakest verifiable constraint qualification conditions. So it's you cannot expect, for instance, to prove MPCC LICQ. This has no chance in this mixed complementarity structure, but at least you can prove the existence of Lagrange multipliers through this relaxed complementarity condition. Now, can this stationarity result be extended to the general problem that's or to a more general setting? That was our interest in principle, to consider not only total variation, but total generalized variation and several other possibilities there. And actually, we could prove that in the general setting meaning the first and second order sparsity-based priors, the problem can be reformulated as a mathematical program with complementarity constraints. And also in those cases, we could prove the existence of Lagrange multipliers that satisfy either an M stationarity system or a strong stationarity system. And we also proved second order sufficient optimality conditions. Under these relaxed constraint qualification conditions, these are not as strong as you are used in the nonlinear optimization setting, but at least you get some local uniqueness of the stationary point. And of course, we could apply to these MPCC problems several algorithms for finding the solution. I will get into that in a while. And there are several applications that can be considered, and we are actually investigating on that at this point, relating, for instance, with different imaging applications. In particular, we are investigating in the seismic imaging setting. So let me go to the implementation details. So just as a reminder, what you have here is a complementarity problem. In the complementarity problem, the MPCC problem has this complementarity system involved, And this is the source of the difficulties for finding out the solution of the optimization problem. And so what it's typically done here is the complementarity system is reformulated and is relaxed so that you get the product smaller than an epsilon, and this is a way of relaxing this complementarity region. And under this relaxation, you can prove the convergence to a C stationary point if you have the MPCC LICQ constraint qualification condition. Now, you have the problem, and then you realize, okay, we can solve that with the standard software, but then the things start to complicate quite a bit because, of course, if you use, for instance, we consider this interior point optimizer, then you plug the problem into this IP-opt, and since you lifted everything and you have a lot of variables, then of course the algorithm doesn't work properly or gets out of memory very easily for small size problems. So you have to figure out how to deal with that solution strategy. So what we did first is we exploited the sparse structure of the Jacobian matrix. So we used this compressed sparse column format to write down the problem in a different form, so that we can exploit this sparsity and make the problem solvable for a larger size of images. This is, however, not enough, since we have to consider some sparsity strategies. Then we have to consider also some matrix-free operators for the gradient, the patches, and so on. And a part of that, the linear systems have to be solved in parallel, because otherwise you cannot really get a solution that it's medium-sized and of interest for the applications. And of course, a part of that, more mathematically speaking, so we had to find a continuation strategy with respect to the relaxation parameter epsilon. So what happens, for instance, in the MRI applications? So as I mentioned before, in this case, we have some training set of corrupted or noisy images. We have the ground truth. And the ground truth in this case is possible to obtain with a full sample of the K-space, as I showed before. So if you have, for instance, a phantom that stays in the machine for a lot of time, then you get a ground truth image of that. And so it's feasible to generate such a training set. And once you have this training set, you can write down the bilevel learning problem in the following way. So you want to find, in principle, a subsample of a specific size. So you just give it in advance, I want, I don't know, 20 points that I want to sample, and you have to minimize, or you want to minimize this loss function, and you have to find in this optimization setting the image that we want to recover, the balance, the parameters lambda that are present in the prior, and also the sample pattern that is provided by these sigma variables that are in principle discrete variables, 0 or 1. So in the lower level problem, you have the variational model, and a part of that you have the discrete variables, and the discrete variables have to sum the size of the set that you want to sample. Now, what we did actually was to get rid of the discrete variables. We used a convex relaxation in this case, which was the easiest strategies. And we considered that the sigma I have to be in the 0-1 interval. And we compensated that with a penalization term in the upper level. So this is a penalty term that enforces the sparsity of the variable sigma. So since we relaxed with the 0-1, we had to move the variable either to 0 or 1, and this term is responsible for that. And we consider also the lower level problem that was written before. So sample pattern in this left-hand side term, and also the balancing term with respect to the total variation there. And we solved the problem to find out what that's about. So this is an example of our results, and we consider, or we compared, this is the ground truth, we compared our pattern, this is our pattern here, which is of course not something that in advance you can imagine, and we compared to two different sample patterns that were available at that point, and were applied actually in the medical setting. And you can observe here what mainly the quality measure is about. So we obtain an improvement of the quality measure with respect to the other sample patterns. And we also tested what happens with the image quality reconstruction with respect to the training set. So I didn't talk about a lot, but of course, if you can imagine, you have to find a training set, or you have to learn from this training set. Then the larger the training set is, then the larger the optimization problem it's also about. So the idea here was to test what is the size of the training set required to get a good reconstruction. And you can observe here that after a sample training set of 10 pairs, then you obtain basically that it stabilizes. So it's not that much of information you need to learn those parameters in this specific context. And a part of that, we tested also the fraction of the K space and what the weight of the regularization is about. So for instance, if you consider the full K space, as I showed before, then you don't need much regularization. If you reduce the fraction of the K sample, then you start having a regularization term that is more present. And of course, if you sample quite a bit of the K space, I mean, if you have a small sample of the K space, then the lambda coefficient is very active. So you can observe that in this specific setting. So let me jump to some conclusions of our work. So first of all, the bilevel learning combines a data-driven approach because it's based on these training sets, but also uses very, very intensively the models that are hidden behind. So it's a combination or it's a hybrid strategy between data-driven and model-based approaches for learning or determining optimal parameters and sampling strategies in variation and inverse problems in this specific context. If you have linear inverse problems, then you can reformulate directly the lower level problem by replacing it with the first order necessary and sufficient optimality condition, and you obtain the standard single level optimization problem that was shown at the beginning. And of course, this is the ideal scenario because you can plug that in any solver and obtain the solution. Now, for imaging problems, we propose this unifying framework that provides a reformulation of the problem for the case of non-smooth sparsity-based regularizers. And we obtain optimality conditions, which are strong in this case, and also some solution strategies. But of course, the resulting MPCCs are very large scale nature, and there are some strategies that you need to figure out for solving this problem numerically. And as I mentioned before, currently we are extending the analytical results to other inverse problems, and we are also trying to develop a software platform for solving bilevel linear learning problems in a useful way for the practitioners. And with that, just let me briefly advertise a summer school we are organizing here in Quito in August 2024. This summer school is on iterative and randomized methods for large-scale inverse problems, and this is part of the Jean Golub SIAM summer schools. And so if you are interested in that, I'll be happy to get your application and provide some information about that. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to get any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Juan Carlos, for that very interesting talk, and probably some of the biggest MPCCs that I think people are solving. Yeah, I guess I could start with a few questions, and maybe after that, Luis might want to ask a few as well. So I was curious, the lambda that you get when you solve this problem, can I consider that to be a parameter vector that's specific for that device that you use to generate the data, and then reuse it maybe to solve, let's say, to denoise future images as well? And the idea of like training and testing, in that sense.
Exactly, that's the idea. So the typical kind of algorithmic, I would say, setting of the learning community is also applied here. So we use the training set, we learn the parameters, and then of course we validate that. And that's what we do. And of course that's the idea, right? Because you cannot learn it every time.
Right. And it looked like there was at least in the one plot there was some kind of saturation as to it was like of the two plots close to the end, but how much more data can actually tell you?
Yeah, I think this one you mean.
Yeah, that one, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there a theoretical result that says that it just kind of tapers off, or do you know anything about
No,
that?
we don't have that. We don't have that. And of course, it has to do, I mean, typically what you have is these theoretical results concerning that the training set has to be larger if the parameters you have to learn are also larger, right? So it's, in our case, it's not that much. It's not a huge neural network.
Right.
So we obtained that experimentally. And I didn't provide any graphic of the validation set, but of course, this is also that we do also to provide a full experimental setting, right, in this context.
Yeah, and you did it for TV, but the method should probably work for all kinds of lower level problems, right?
Yeah, so it's like we are right now in the paper that was published this year. So we had a very general setting where we have the Bilevel learning with total variation, total generalized variation, and so on. And currently what we are doing is writing another one with the computational results related to that, because of course, if you have the total generalized variation, as was the question before, you extend the number of variables also in the primal formulation. So you have more variables in the primal one and more auxiliary variables, and you have a huge system that you have to solve, and that's not easy.
Very nice. And I guess more of a methodological question. So when you introduce that first order system for the lower level problem and you get this Q variable, I guess there is no smoothing involved, right? That's the real, let's say, optimality conditions.
Exactly.
But have you tried doing something like using a regularization based on maybe regularizing the dual functional of that KVI term, the second, I guess, what is that, the total variation? Like, have you tried any of these methods where, like, you say, okay, I use something that's smooth and instead of...
Yeah, that's the first thing we did, actually. So that was regularized and then doing the asymptotic analysis of that to get optimality conditions. Now, if you do that and you regularize in such a way, what you get as the stationarity system was only some sort of Clark stationarity system that was not strong enough. So in this case, with the lifting strategy, we could prove actually the M and the strong stationarity systems, right?
Nice. Great. So, Luis, do you have any questions that came up in the meantime?
Yep. It's going to be a bit basic because my experience with Bilevel optimization was like doing the simplest approach possible, and so the first thing I want to ask is, what solver are you using once you do like the transformation of the Bilevel problem and you obtain the problem that you are using? What the software or solver are using?
Yeah, I mentioned that. I will put it again. Let me just put the full screen.
Yeah.
So what we consider is this PyOpt sparse solver. But this PyOpt sparse solver uses actually as the motor this IPOpt method, which is quite well known. But that was not enough, right? So as I mentioned, then we had to use some specific structure for the matrices, and we use this compressed sparse column format. And also the operators have to be sparse and the parallel solver. So it's a bunch of solvers that we use all together to get the solution.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, because I don't know these solvers.
But the basic one was this one, this pi-opt sparse.
Okay. And I guess this one is not restricted to some subsets of functions, like it's not requiring convexity of the objective functions, I suppose.
No.
All right.
That's a very general nonlinear programming solver.
Okay. Another question is, how does this compare to taking the original problem and generating the inner problem, which I suppose is convex? Is it possible to input this inner problem into a differentiable convex optimization layer, which is a tool developed by Boyd that it's meant for very general applications of convex, like if you have a process such as a neural network, and then you want to substitute some part of the neural network with an optimization solver, this tool allows to do backpropagation, but it's not restricted to neural network learning. You could take, I guess, this problem that you had like at the beginning, the bilevel problem, input the inner problem in the convex optimization layer, and then ask for the gradient of the whole problem, and do something simple such as Adam gradient-based optimization. I don't know if you have tried some, like it's probably less efficient, but I don't know if you have tried such an approach and compared.
We didn't ourselves. I mean, I don't know specifically the technique you mentioned, to be honest. But there are several approaches where the solution mapping of the lower level is approximated with a couple of iterations, for instance, and using that. I mean, not to mention the regularization we talked about with Thomas a couple of minutes ago, but just to not solve fully the lower level. So these are strategies that are considered. Of course, you don't have a gradient, right? So this is the main issue. You have a subgradient in the best scenario, so you have to investigate those things. But in principle, some approximations of the lower level in a differential form are also considered. If I understood correctly, and
Yeah. I think if your inner problem is convex, this is, I think the only issue is the thing that it's probably a generalized gradient and not a gradient like a proper gradient. But in practice, it's sometimes you just ignore that it's not a proper gradient. You try and then you get results. And then it's not a very mathematical way of approaching things. But if you try and it goes well, it's probably because there's some nice characteristics that you are not modeling. But it's good to know also about like approximations about running a couple of iterations and trying with those ones. That's good too. I have another question. How do you obtain the training data? Because I suppose you need pairs of clean images and corrupted images. Again, sorry if you mentioned that, but I may have missed it.
Yeah. So let me go back to the other thing. So if you want to solve kind of the problem, then of course you can obtain, or you can try different strategies that are more easy than the one I presented, right? So if you regularize, for instance, then you find a solution. Okay, maybe not the precise system, but you have a solution. Or if you have a couple of iterations of the lower level and you replace those, you get also a solution. So our idea was also to provide a more theoretical inside of the structure of the optimality system. That's why also we do this reformulation and so on. And we want to also prove that or provide an algorithmic setting that is efficient, even in the case that you don't regularize. But of course, if you regularize, then you get a much easier problem to solve. Yeah, so I mentioned this training set in the context of MRI. Of course, in general, you have a different sorts of sources of training sets nowadays. I mean, it's quite common to find databases that provides you already with the training sets. In the case that I mentioned, let me try to go back a bit. So in the case of the MRI, actually what you have is a very straightforward form of getting these training sets. Because if you have a patient that is in the machine for 1 hour, let's say, then you have a perfect reconstruction. So you sample the full case space and you have a perfect reconstruction. So if you put the same patient, okay, everything now at this moment is just imaginary, of course, but if you have a patient in the machine for 1 hour, you get a perfect image. If you have the same patient for 5 minutes, then you have the noisy one. So it's very easy to obtain this training set in this specific application. Of course, you don't do that with patients. You do that with phantoms. And that's what you do in this context, right? But in different other applications, I would say nowadays you have a lot of databases that provides you training sets. So it's quite available.
Good. Thanks.
Great. But before we go, I have one more question I just thought of as you guys were discussing. When you do the relaxation for the MRI problem, originally you had a really nasty integer, mixed integer NLP, and then you relaxed the integrality, and you include this capital phi. So usually in integer programming, people get very upset about this, because then what you've done is somehow really moved away potentially from the original combinatorial problem. I guess, like, what is the phi that you use, and how do you deal with the fact that the answers you get might not be integral, and therefore you won't know necessarily where to sample from?
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest about this whole thing, right? So we rounded also the final solution that we had.
Yeah.
Now I know that what you mentioned, because we're working on a project with Christian Maya concerning this mixed integer MPCC fact. So you have to of course you have to convexify in some way, but you also have to consider more refined strategies to get a solution, right? So we are working on that. It's not a solved issue, and in this case we wanted as an approximation, of course, of that. So I don't want to upset the integer programming community, but the fact is that we are still working on that, and it's actually a very interesting and promising application field.
Yeah, I agree. So Palman's also from Christian's department. I don't know if you've met him.
I know him, yeah.
Yeah, he and I were looking at a way of relaxing integer control problems, where Paul is using kind of a TV regularization, which is nice, because then when you use TV as a regularization, so you can imagine phi being TV of sigma. And it's nice because then sort of you sort of damp the number of jumps that the control can take, I guess. And then we asked ourselves, like, okay, well, what's a little bit further away from TV that's not quite, let's say, H1 or L2, that would still be in a Hilbert space? And so we came up with HS with S less than 1. And it turns out that you don't get the same properties as TV, but you do get some similar properties, and you are allowed to stay in a Hilbert space context. And if you can somehow move yourself away from the infinite dimensional control aspect and just think of sort of a discrete version of the HS norm, then you might be able to use that here for that capital phi as well. So you would like somehow have to map the sigma here as a vector into 0, 1, as being somehow related to like a discrete control and then put that into a discrete HS norm. And then you'd still be in a Hilbert space, and that might actually be something computationally viable. It's a
that may be a good idea. So to be honest, Thomas, I didn't want to go in detail into the function space setting for this type of problems because it was already very difficult in the finite dimensional setting. But yes, so the idea for us and what we are currently working, I didn't explore this type of regularization that you mentioned. It may be a good idea. But of course, using the techniques that also Paul uses in the case of this type of mixed integer bi-level learning strategy, so something that we are considering right now. Yeah,
I think that, and like this, I've seen from Søren Bartels and Harvey Antiu and a couple others, this idea of using sort of non-local operators as part of the regularization, but you could probably also use it as part of like the functional phi as well. Like if you think about each of those pixels are close to each other, and so maybe the sigma should somehow be related, so you would like they wouldn't be completely separated from each other. You'd get a.
You mean for the lower level in this case?
Actually, well, they use it for the lower level. Right,
yeah.
But I'm thinking like again for the upper level to use some kind
that
of
may be wise. Yeah, for the lower level, I'm not so optimistic. I think total variation, or these non-smooth sparsity-based priors are doing better than the fractional Sobolev space norms.
Oh, really?
But
Okay.
in the upper level, that may be wise. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Great. Then I think I've asked you enough questions. It's been an hour. Let me pause it.
But that was the purpose, right?